Sunday, May 11, 2025. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. Our guest today is a clinical instructor at the Harvard Law School Cyber Law Clinic, a civil rights attorney and trans rights activist. Alejandra Caraballo, welcome to the Weekend Show.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the big story this week, that is that the Supreme Court on Tuesday allowed Donald Trump to implement his ban on transgender people serving in the military. The justices granted an emergency request from the Trump administration to lift a nationwide injunction blocking the policy while litigation continues. All three liberal justices dissented, of course, but this is a massive shift, isn't it? This kind of means that around 4,000 transgender people who currently serve in the military are just going to be kicked out. I mean, it's as simple as that, isn't it? You've been very vocal with your views online. Let's just talk about what this actually means for people.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's most important to understand is just how unusual this kind of situation is, where the Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court, I mean, less than 2 months after the litigation was announced and filed, to basically allow the administration to kick trans people out of the military while the case is pending, because it had been enjoined. So that's where the court issues a block at the district level, at the local level, basically saying that the Trump administration could not remove trans people while the litigation was pending. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the intermediate court, said, no, the block will remain in effect while the litigation is pending and the appeal is pending. And then they basically made an emergency appeal. These kinds of emergency appeals had been very rare in the Obama administration and the Bush administration. I believe like already in the first 100 days, we've had nearly as many, or if not more, emergency applications than the entirety of the Obama administration. So just to show how uncommon this is and how out of the usual this is. And the Supreme Court is essentially mostly rewarding the Trump administration for going through with these kinds of emergency applications, because they're continuing to win on this. And so beyond just kind of the unusual procedural issues around this, the Supreme Court didn't give a reason why they needed to act on this and allow the military to purge trans people from its ranks while the litigation is pending. So even if down the line the court finds that this policy violates the Constitution and unfairly targets and unconstitutionally targets trans people, the damage is done, right? That could be 3, 6 months, or even a year from now. The trans people are already going to be separated from the military, and it's going to be much, much harder for the government to reintegrate them. And then depending on how the case even comes out, there may not even really be an option, because they may just simply go back to the drawing board and redo the policy in a way that may pass constitutional muster, which is essentially what happened with the travel ban in the first administration. And similarly, the Supreme Court let the trans military ban go into effect in 2019. So this is not the first time the court has done so. And so what really worries me, though, is that this kind of shadow docket decision portends potentially what may be coming down the pike in terms of a case that they've already heard at the beginning of the term called Scrimeti, which dealt with a ban on gender-affirming care for trans youth coming out of Tennessee. And the Supreme Court's due to rule on that by June. And the fundamental principle at play there is whether or not targeting trans people either as a class or on the basis of sex violates the Constitution under the Equal Protection Clause, and whether or not trans people on the basis of on the basis of sex or as a class merit what's called heightened scrutiny, which is an exacting level of scrutiny by the courts. And basically what this says to me is that potentially the courts or the Supreme Court might be already having decided Scrimeti and just is, ironing out the specific details but basically is going to say that trans people are not protected on the basis of sex or on their own class status. And as a result, basically any of the policies that the Trump administration does targeting trans people could potentially pass constitutional muster by default.
How do you think trans people might be feeling in the military who have given their service for many, many years in some cases, to suddenly be segregated for their gender rather than anything to do with their ability to work, in active duty?
Yeah, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I mean, the insult to their service is just abhorrent. I don't even know how I can even put it into words. I mean, to come from a president who notoriously is a draft dodger, and had bone spurs to get out of military service, to kick out people who have dedicated oftentimes decades of their lives to serving this country admirably, it's beyond an insult. And then also coming from this defense secretary who is just endangering national security, including his wife on Signal chats, had substantial issues with alcoholism and substance abuse. And, I think it's the biggest insult on top of everything, in the fact that like these two dishonorable people are telling honorable trans military members that they can no longer serve by virtue of who they are.
Pete Hegseth posted on X on Tuesday, no more dudes in dresses, we're done with that shit.
I mean, that's literally the exact type of animus that the district court found was like exactly motivating this. It's not about readiness. It's not about morale or anything else. It's literally about a hatred of trans people and wanting to eradicate us from society. And essentially the Supreme Court seems to be on board with that project and that political project of eradication. And, I think that in particular, also centers the issue of trans misogyny. Like, this is all focused on trans women, but trans men are also serving in the military. And most of the time, like they aren't as visible in this debate, but like they're also being affected by this.
Cis women are also the next on the chopping block as far as Pete Hegseth is concerned. He doesn't believe that anybody that doesn't fit his mold for this kind of archetypal male war fighter, as he describes them, that's kind of where this is heading, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, he during his confirmation hearings, they were asking him about this, and he tried to walk it back, but it's very clear he doesn't believe women should be serving in the military. And if it wasn't for the fact that the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was repealed through Congress, I wouldn't be surprised if he tried to reenact a Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, or just a full-on ban of gay folks in the military overall. And I think one of the other policies that went overlooked in the first Trump administration was this deployment readiness test that was also purging the military of people with HIV. And and so that's another disproportionate. Basically, anyone that doesn't fit this like white Christian male, straight Christian male, like mold is essentially should be pushed out of the military. And it obviously ending all of the diversity programs and everything else. I mean, they purged all of these books out of the military academies, but they kept Mein Kampf. Like, it's very clear, like, what this is about. It's about white supremacy more than anything.
And Nazism, we should say that out loud too. So much of this goes back to Project 2025. All this stuff was written and listed in this mandate for leadership, and this far-right Christian nationalist movement, they're all buying into it. But it seems that the Supreme Court is baked into that too. I mean, we know that the court obviously is packed and stacked with people who are in the tank for Trump, but they're also in the tank for white supremacy. I mean, even Clarence Thomas, it seems.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, it goes back to the Students for Fair Admission case, but even goes back before that to the Shelby County case, gutting the Voting Rights Act. Like, this has been a court that has been steadily and methodically eroding the fundamental protections that were won during the Civil Rights era. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, all of these things that have been enshrined into law for decades, they have been consistently eroding them, and worse, turning them on their head, essentially saying that, no, the Civil Rights Act actually is requiring that you must ensure that a sufficient number of white people are in these positions, and that if you have too many people of color, it's evidence of de facto discrimination. I mean, that's essentially the kinds of arguments that they're making in the wake of for folks who don't know what the Students for Fair Admission case was. It was the case that against Harvard and University of North Carolina that gutted, and I don't even want to say affirmative action because it wasn't affirmative action. It was race conscious admissions, which is substantially different. It's where if all things being equal, like, you can take into account that maybe somebody is coming from a underprivileged racial background, and you could take that into account, like if they have identical SAT scores, identical grades, everything else, like, there'll be a preference, because otherwise, like, without that racial conscious decision making, it almost inevitably always falls towards the white person. But in the aftermath, when they started releasing some of the demographics of the students who have entered some of these elite universities in the aftermath, the org behind Students for Fair Admission, or the folks behind that, basically said some of these schools still aren't admitting, essentially, like, they're basically saying they weren't admitting enough white people. Like, there were still too many people of color getting in, so they think that they were still doing racial conscious admissions. And it was like very clear. It's like, wait, you're saying that, like, you expect that, people of color can't get in under a neutral system. And so they really always want to talk about meritocracy, but what they really mean is this idea that only white people merit admission into elite universities. I mean, that's fundamentally what they believe.
I heard Trump talking about him going into the flight deck of Air Force One and seeing this pilot who he said he was more handsome than Tom Cruise, and that he kept talking about how perfect he was, because he referred to him as a perfect specimen. We know Trump's obsessed with eugenics and this kind of white Aryan race, and because this guy, had the right skin tone and a full head of hair and the pearly white teeth and was tall and handsome, that was what Trump clearly was exposing as the only type of people they really want. And anybody who doesn't really fit that mold, as far as he's concerned, is not up to standard. The Supreme Court ruling this week kind of said a similar thing about trans people. It basically said that they were defective in some way. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, well, the ruling itself didn't say, they didn't give any reasoning or rationale, but right. The underlying district court decision, which was what was under review here, from a odd procedural posture, essentially looked at the kinds of statements that they were making, that saying that trans people, by virtue of being transgender, are at odds with living an honorable and truthful lifestyle. Like, basically saying that trans people are dishonorable and that, they aren't compatible with the standards of military service. And I mean, that kind of overt animus, which is the kind of both the constitutional test and both the lay term animus, like, is demonstrated. You mentioned the comment about, like, no dudes in dresses or whatnot. Like, that speaks to what this is about. Like, these are folks now, like, that are completely unhinged in terms of their transphobia. Like, we have Nancy Mace going around screaming, like, the T slur constantly on the floor of the House, in committee, and just even at constituents. It's just like, they've just gone crazy with, like, basically being able to go after a vulnerable minority with no political repercussions for it.
So trans people are the kind of current target, but we look through history, and if we start with the Jews in the 1920s and 30s and bring it bang up to date, and everybody in between, and racial hate crime obviously spiked under Trump, and when the COVID was happening, there was all the Asian hate crime, as he spoke about the China virus and all this kind of stuff. But right now, trans people are the focus. And it seems from what you're saying that, in the military, it's going to next be cis women and potentially anybody who identifies LGBTQ plus. The warnings from history are not to be ignored, are they? Because this is not going to get better. The trajectory for this is only going to get worse for minority groups.
Yeah, one of the things that I posted about on the day of the Supreme Court decision on this was May 6th, and 92 years ago on May 6th in 1933 in Berlin, Germany, the Nazis raided Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sex. I don't know if anyone's seen the movie The Danish Girl with Eddie Raymond. Essentially, this was the first place where LGBTQ people, and particularly trans folks, were viewed without judgment and were allowed to access healthcare in a way that seemed almost inconceivable from us in our perspective almost 100 years later, happening in Germany in the 1920s and 30s in the Weimar Republic. And, the famous pictures of the book burnings that occurred, when the Nazis took power, most of the contents were from the Institute for Sex or sexology, or it doesn't really have a directly translatable word from German. But it was run by Magnus Hirschfeld, and it contained records and studies and the first scientific, and medical evidence around working with trans people. And a lot of people don't know that happened. And so this is not the first time, this kind of attack, has happened. And one of the things I always try to tell people is that this kind of hate does not stay contained. You cannot just say, we're only going to target one vulnerable minority and then basically say that, that's it, we're done here. And I think, particularly the case of Shiloh Hendricks over the last week has really demonstrated that, where the far right has basically said, we're going to reward this white woman who hurled the N-word at a 5-year-old child on a playground with $1 million in fundraising. It's just, it just shocks you to your core. And it's just, showing that it's not just about trans people. This is broader, part of a broader project to reassert white male dominance in society and to push out anyone else that challenges that, or doesn't fit that mold.
Almost 1% of the US population identifies as transgender. It's not a completely accurate number, is it? It could be a whole lot more than that, because as we know, people are often either frightened to come out and identify in that way, or certainly fill in the census in that way. And I'm sure that's only going to get worse with future censuses. But the numbers here, we're talking effectively about 2.5 million adults that identify as trans in the US. And yet the understanding of gender dysmorphia and the kind of clinical aspects of this are rarely talked about. And in fact, a lot of people hurling abuse towards trans people probably couldn't describe what it really is. They've probably never met a trans person. And so there is this kind of huge miscommunication, isn't there, about certain minority groups in the US. It's not typical just to this country. Of course, this happens all over the world. But what would you say to people here who are kind of keen to get into it? Because I think maybe there is a fear to have kind of open conversations about how trans people really feel in this moment.
Yeah, I think there's always a misconception that trans folks aren't willing to talk and explain and whatnot. And I think a lot of us know that in any given day we're interacting with someone who doesn't realize that that they're interacting with a trans person, or they believe that they've never interacted with a trans person. Because I guarantee you everyone in this audience has interacted with a trans person or has met a trans person. They just don't realize it. And so, whether or not they consciously know or not, I think a lot of trans folks are more than willing to be patient. And I think a lot of folks have this misconception that's like, if you misgender a trans person or something like once or twice, that suddenly it's going to be this horrible thing. And really, I think for most trans people, it's really about look, was it really intentional? Are you doing it to try and harm us? Right? Are you going out of your way? If it was a, unintended mistake, that happens, right? It's just people get misgendered on occasion. These kinds of things happen. And I think there's a lot more grace and forgiveness that trans people have that I think the popular misconception tries to exaggerate that somehow we're overly sensitive and that we're just going to completely just combust if someone makes a mistake. And so I think on that end, I think if you approach in good faith, I think that's not an issue. And I think, it's really hard because there aren't that many of us. There's only 2.5 million out of 340 million Americans. And so it's less than 1 in 100 or so. It's anywhere from give or take, depending on the survey, anywhere from about 0.5% to about 1.5% of the population, on average about a percentage point. And so if 1 out of every 100, most people only have 3 or 4 close friends and then a few close family members. And so just out of the odds, most people are not going to have a trans family member. They're not going to have a trans friend. And so that makes it a lot more difficult because this shows up in the polling when people, they break down, are you supportive of trans rights? And knowing a trans person, it makes almost an order of magnitude different in their willingness to support trans issues. Because we're just like anyone else. We are just trying to get through the day, pay our bills, work, get through work. And the only difference is we identify as a different gender than the one that was assigned to us at birth. That's really all that's the difference. And, and I think part of that deficit of people knowing trans folks has made it easier to demonize our community because it's easier to demonize what you don't know. And I think it's also scarier for people when they don't know a certain community or whatnot. And so I think that's why some of these attacks have landed. That being said, I think the most recent election was won in spite of the anti-trans attack ads rather than because of. And I think there was a lot of attention paid because of how high profile they were. But I really don't think that trans issues move the needle one way or the other, because I don't think it is salient for people's lives. Most people don't go around thinking about who's using the bathroom and who's competing in sports, especially in some of these sports that they've never even thought of twice. Right. And so, I think that aspect of it, really just it's kind of the perfect political weapon in terms of they're able to scapegoat a minority that furthers their white nationalist project, but not get any blowback in terms of political pushback against it.
So fear of the other, and the other at this moment in time happens to be trans people. And do you think, because there was criticism of Kamala Harris's campaign, that there was too much focus on trans rights and that put people off. Now, I don't happen to agree that was the case, but that was some of the rhetoric that came out of the kind of post-analysis. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I think that's a complete media fiction that she was obsessed with trans people. Literally, it was the Trump campaign that spent $250 million on trans ads, right? They're the ones that was talking about it every other sentence. And Kamala Harris never once uttered the word trans in her entire campaign. None of her campaign policies mentioned trans people. And this most recent DNC last summer was the first time since 2012 that there had not been a trans person that had spoken as part of the DNC main stage events. In 2016 and 2020, there was a trans person that spoke. 2024, there wasn't. And so, if anything, there was a very conscious effort among the Democrats in the Harris campaign to actually avoid talking about trans people entirely. And they viewed it as essentially a distraction. And so I think like the narrative and the perception didn't actually match reality. And there's this kind of weird dynamic at play where Republicans can just literally obsess about trans people to the exclusion of all else. They will not talk about actual economic issues. They won't talk about any of the things of substance that matter to people. And they'll spend $250 million on ads talking about trans people. And somehow it becomes the Democrats that are obsessed with trans people. Like that, I don't understand why that's the case, but that's just universally how it always ends up working out. And it's so frustrating because no matter what the Democrats do, if they just avoid trans issues entirely, they still get painted with this brush that they're obsessed with the issue. And I think in reality, like the support from the Democratic Party has been a begrudging one of just, we are liberal in the sense that we believe that, in an equal democracy that allows everyone an opportunity to participate in society. And we want to at least allow for the minimal protections. And so most of the support has been, we just don't want trans people to be discriminated against. Like that's the bare basic proposition. Rather than some full-throated like gender revolution of gender abolition or something like that. Like that, Judith Butler is not the one running in the Democratic Party. And so I think it's kind of frustrating, that the Democrats get painted in that brush. It's really, really incredibly frustrating on how that works out.
I'm with you, and I agree. It's like what we read and what we see are two different things. But this is the power of propaganda, and this is why Trump was able to win the election, because telling the truth is irrelevant in this post-truth society. We have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk a little bit more, and maybe go a bit deeper about the misunderstandings about transgender, and also if it is a choice. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Did you know that when your metabolism is working properly, you will feel the benefits in literally every aspect of your life? I have found a valuable tool that gives me insights to create a healthy metabolism for my body. It's called Lumen. It's the world's first handheld metabolic coach, a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs. It gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workouts, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism, whether you're burning mostly fats or carbs. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. Your metabolism is your body's engine. It's how your body turns the food you eat into the fuel that keeps you going. And because your metabolism is at the center of everything that your body does, optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits, including easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, and better sleep. Take the next step to improving your health. Go to lumen.me/weekend to get 20% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/weekend. for 20% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. If you've ever searched your own name or address in Google, it's shocking to find how many results have your personal information. And it's not by chance. Data brokers and people search sites collect your personal information, your name, address, phone number, financial information, income, and hundreds of other records. They sell and share it publicly without your consent. But Incogni is here to put an end to that. It hunts down these unethical sites and gets your information removed from the places that expose your private data. You don't have to email anyone, fill out any forms, or jump through hoops. They handle the entire process for you. Incogni is also continuously monitoring to see if your data is put back onto these databases, requesting repeated removals. This way, keeping them off forever, so you get way less spam calls, spam emails, and get more peace of mind. And best of all, you can cancel any time, and they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can get it completely risk-free. Right now, you can get 60% off an annual plan by going to incogni.com and use code WEEKEND. That's incogni.com/weekend and use code WEEKEND at checkout. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Get 60% off an annual plan at incogni.com/weekend and use code WEEKEND at checkout. We're back on the Weekend Show with Alejandra Caraballo. I'm Anthony Davis. I was talking to a friend the other day who identifies as a Democrat, who seemed to be completely out of step understanding about being trans and the fact that it's not a choice, that you are born. I was trying to say you're basically born trans. And then I had to say to him, well, when did you decide to be male? When did you decide to be straight? Like, when did you make that decision? And he's like, well, I didn't. And I'm like, well, nor do they. And we argued for most of our stroll together. I think of myself as fortunate in as much as I grew up in London. When I was 7 years old, we bought a house that belonged to a very famous trans composer called Angela Morley, who actually worked on Star Wars and stuff. And so as a kid, my parents explained to me whose house we'd bought. And it was a very kind of well-known story in Britain that this amazing composer, Wally Stott, had become Angela Morley. And so I was kind of quite proud of my knowledge of this area, even as an 8-year-old kid. And then I grew up, obviously, in a metropolis, and most of my friends were, I had such a mixed group of friends, but I had friends who were trans, I had friends who hadn't yet transitioned, and so I was with them during that period. So for me, it comes under the banner of normal, and I've had a million conversations till very late in the night about how it feels. But as I said at the beginning, I think of myself as fortunate that I grew up in this way. America is so much larger landmass than the UK, and there are so many people growing up in small towns where they're never going to come across these people or indeed have these conversations. So maybe we can talk to this for a moment and just dispel some myths about the fact that, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I'll just pose that same question. Yeah. Is it a choice?
Yeah, I think that question really misses the point in the sense of, like, what if it wasn't, it shouldn't matter, right? Like, but because I think it puts so much of the onus on, like, this involuntary thing that we're just coming into the world as. And I think it's a framing that's been brought from, I think, particularly the gay rights debate. I happen to think, I think we are born this way, and I don't think it's immutable in the sense that it's not subject to external change. But I think at the same time, like, if we want to think about broader issues of freedom and whatnot, like, if you want to be genderqueer and just, experiment with your gender expression, like, you should be free to do so. Like that's, I think, part of a broader conception of freedom is escaping these kinds of rigid gender norms. But, I think one of the broader issues with familiarity with trans folks is that because our history isn't taught, and I think you were fortunate in that you grew up in a home and you knew this from a young age, but a lot of folks don't realize that, like, trans folks have been around. I think for a lot of people, they're like, oh, this community just came out of nowhere in like 2015 or something, right?
That's right. And that more people are trans now, in as much as RFK Jr. is saying that there are more people who have autism now, and it's just simply not the case.
Yeah, and so I mean, there's famous histories. Like there's a famous French spy who infiltrated the Russian imperial court of the the empress or the czar in Russia, and and got a declaration from King Louis be recognized as a woman. I mean, we're talking the 1700s France. This isn't exactly the most woke time ever. And there's, trans military veterans from the Civil War, such as Albert Cashier, who lived his entire life as a man, served in the Civil War. And it wasn't even discovered he was transgender until he had developed dementia in a care facility, and they realized when they were bathing him like that he didn't have the genitalia of typically of a man, and so there's all these folks throughout history that we can point to and say, like, no, trans folks have been here all along. And even if what we would think of as probably not the most accepting or welcoming societies, like I always like to point to the story of Albert Cashier, because they were going to deny his pension or benefits and they were essentially going to try and charge him with fraud. And his fellow Civil War veterans like wrote in letters of support saying, no, we know who he is. Like we've always served with him, and we don't care what anyone says. Like this is our comrade who fought with us in the trenches in the Civil War. And I think that also speaks to just like when folks get to know trans folks, like, it just makes such a world of difference. And I think it goes back also to what we were talking about, the trans people in the military. Like trans folks have always been in the military, whether you realized it or not. And there are going to be trans folks that continue to be in the military. Whether or not they try to ban us or not, just as there were always gay people in the military. And so, yeah, our history has always been here. And I think one of the other examples I always like to mention is like, there was this pretty good movie. I think it holds up okay. There was a few things, probably don't, but it is what it is. But in 1974, there's this movie called Dog Day Afternoon featuring Al Pacino at the height of Godfather 2 fame. Like imagine like the biggest movie star on the planet in 1974 was Al Pacino. And, he does this movie called Dog Day Afternoon. It was a smaller film, and it was based on a true story of a guy who robs a bank in order to pay for gender affirming surgery for his girlfriend. And he gets busted by the end of it and arrested. But because he sold the film rights to the story while he was in prison, he was actually able to then subsequently pay for his partner's surgery. So it had a happy ending, but it was like, 1974, height of his fame, Al Pacino's doing a movie where he's robbing a bank to pay for his girlfriend's gender affirming surgery. So like, it's not for lack of recognition. I think, what has changed in the United States is one of like, especially in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was some like lack of knowledge of trans people, but when trans people did come up, there was a sense of, oh, that's interesting. Almost like a benign ignorance of like, not in a pejorative way, but like, oh, we just don't know what this is about. Oh, okay. Like I can understand. And then I think really starting, in the 80s and 90s where pop culture, I think particularly when you talk about like Ace Ventura or Pet Detective, like the entire setup of that movie was a transphobic joke. And like trans people became much more of just an overt punchline. There became to be this group of people to be looked down upon. Right. And I think, in that sense, like that's how things have changed. So yeah, I think we've always been here, and no matter like what efforts people are going to go through, like we'll always be here. And I think one of the things that people have always said is that even if you killed every single trans person on the planet, within a generation, there'll be more trans people, because we are a part of the human condition and we're a natural part of humanity.
There haven't really been any characters in American popular culture. I'm just trying to think about the difference from, when I was growing up, like in James Bond movies, there was famously one of the Bond girls, Tula, was trans and was the most beautiful woman, and nobody knew. And then when the story came out, everyone was like, wow. They could have gone, but they were like, wow, like this is kind of brilliant. And, obviously we had Quentin Crisp, the Englishman in New York, and just things that were baked into our culture that maybe made Brits a little bit more accommodating and less threatened. But isn't that the difference, maybe, is that in the US now certainly there is like a fear of trans people, because as Nancy Mace describes, she thinks that trans people get pleasure from exposing themselves in bathrooms. And then the idea that trans people are more likely to be promiscuous or in some way want to, show off their genitals. I mean, it's so completely misguided and offensive, and yet that is the current rhetoric.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of it is repackaged homophobia. I mean, if you went to the 1990s or 1980s, there was a ton of discussion or concern about sharing locker rooms with gay men or gay women because, what if they look at me? And so like it's exactly the same debate. It's just happening for trans people. It's interesting because there is in some ways in the public imagination, trans people like everything. I always say there's nothing ever really truly new. And we had a trans sports debate in the 1970s with Renee Richards. And if you really want the really weird connection, Renee Richards was outed by Tucker Carlson's father.
Wow.
So just, there's generational hatred of trans people in that family. But, she wanted to compete and fought a court case in the 1970s to be able to compete as a woman in tennis, and ultimately won the case. And that set their standard around testosterone levels that was, around for decades. And so, I think it's frustrating because I think in a lot of ways, we haven't had a singular pop culture figure, I think, until Laverne Cox and begrudgingly Caitlyn Jenner, in the 2010s. But that, I think, is because of the way that the trans community had been oriented around in terms of transition goals, right? I think prior to about the mid 2000s, the goals for most trans people was you're not out to anyone. You transition. I mean, the advice had been until the 1990s that you would just disappear to another town. You would stop talking to your family. No one knows who you are. You transition so that no one could out you. And you could quietly blend in with society. And that was viewed as the successful goal, right? There wasn't this idea of owning being trans and being public and saying, no, I'm a trans person. I think that's what really changed in the last 2 decades around what it meant to be a trans person. And so I think in that sense, we didn't have a lot of public figures, and the ones that were out there were, outed against their wishes. And I think this came up with Kim Petras winning a Grammy the other year. She's a trans singer out of Germany, and she won a Grammy, and people were saying, she's the first trans person to win a Grammy. And I was like, no, actually Wendy Carlos in I think it was 1972 or 1973, won a Grammy for helping with the soundtrack of The Shining. And she helped invent a lot of the technology that went into making Moogs and synthesizers and electronic music. And so, it's really that people don't realize that we've been around.
Well, it goes back to my connection with Angela Morley, who I think won a whole bunch of awards, and again for composing, and often uncredited, because even to get a credit was hard enough in the music business as a cis woman, let alone a trans woman. And so, the world does need to change, and it's hard, isn't it? Because in some countries, and for those of us who've traveled, and especially for Europeans, none of this is an issue in the same way. There's starting to be, obviously, as the far right finds traction in some countries, and it's undoubtedly the case in Germany with the AfD, certainly in the UK with the Reform Party. But this kind of rise of anti-anything that isn't kind of this nationalistic view of perfection. And that's something that countries individually are having to deal with. But to be able to draw comparisons because you've traveled or because you understand other cultures is always very helpful. Here I sometimes feel like we're starting from ground zero on some of these subjects. I just, I would love for like the Republican Party to be forced to watch RuPaul's Drag Race, like back to back, just to get an education into personality types. Because it's, it is a surprise that the Republican Party are old white men invariably, none of whom identify as gay. And there was one gay one who enjoyed cross-dressing, and they got him out. So it's just not real, is it?
Yeah, I think so much of it is just a fear of of things that are different. I mean, xenophobia, it's probably one of the perfect words for it, but I think that really plays into it. And it's a sense that like there are people that are different from you, whether it's, they're immigrants or have a different religion or a different race or ethnicity, or different gender. Suddenly like these things somehow are a threat. And it's frustrating because it's not the case at all. And I think there's a lot of, what I think I get frustrated because you mentioned gay Republicans like George Santos, obviously Rick Grinnell, who's been a big Trumper for years. What frustrates me about them or especially like Peter Thiel and others, like the only reason they're able to be openly gay as they are now is because of the gay rights movement. And it's one that they've essentially tarred and feathered and like tried to like to discredit and basically say, we've gotten enough that a wealthy white gay man can exist in society out, and like that, don't go any further than that. Right. And
being wealthy and white is obviously what helps, right? Because if he was poor and black, then he would not be accepted.
Right. And I think that's what's particularly frustrating, especially with like folks like Peter Thiel. Like, I don't know if it's a level of narcissism that believes that they are somehow immune from these things. And I mean, historically, history is littered with examples of people who thought they were the exception and that somehow their status would protect them. I mean, Ernst Röhm, there's a meme online that people jokingly say is like the Ernst Röhm Award for collaboration, which like queer folks put on like other queer folks' page who like collaborate with Republicans and others in pushing anti-LGBTQ policies. And for a lot of folks who don't know, the SA was essentially like what people think of as the brown shirts, right? Like the prototypical brown shirts were the SA under the Nazis, and they only existed until 1934. Everyone's familiar with the SS, but the SA were really the kind of Nazi shock troopers. And they were headed by a guy named Ernst Röhm, who was pretty openly, like it was an open secret, he was gay. And Hitler tolerated him, and essentially because knowing he needed control of the SA. But Ernst Röhm thought he was safe. He was like, I'm not one of those effeminate gays, right? Like I'm part of the, like he was part of the Nazi party and, was part of the military and was like, macho man or whatnot. They killed him in the Night of the Long Knives, right? And they purged him. And so it's very clear that, at the end of the day, when you collaborate with fascist politics, like it's not going to spare you. If you think that you're going to be the exception or that somehow your wealth and privilege or status is going to protect you, it doesn't, because as I mentioned earlier, like you cannot contain hate. Once you let that Frankenstein monster out, actually I shouldn't say Frankenstein because it's the opposite. But once you let that monster out, you can no longer control it. It is going to devour everything in sight. And I think it's
Mr. Hyde as opposed to Dr. Jekyll, I guess.
Yes, that is a more appropriate metaphor.
I want to we talked a little about the being trans not being a choice in the same way that being straight or cisgender is not a choice. But I want to talk about why nobody would choose it, because again, this is something that I don't think people fully understand. Now, I'm keen to hear your experience, but from the conversations I've had with my friends, they wouldn't wish being trans on anybody based upon what they had to go through before they were able to live fully in their gender. And that has been really the hardest thing for them, is that, it's not an easy life for a lot of trans people by nature of the society that they live in, and that just by people misunderstanding what it means, even simple things that people might take for granted become that much more difficult if you are trans, including getting a job.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the unemployment rates for trans people, it's Great Depression level. I mean, it's like 30% unemployment for trans people. The level of discrimination is just so rampant. And I hate to think of like being trans as a negative. Like, it is honestly been a privilege of my life to have this experience and like be able to experience the world in different ways that like most people never get to experience. Right. Like, in a lot of ways, like I walk the world in two shoes, right? Like I got to experience like the first 25 years of my life, like what it's like to be a boy and a man, and then kind of understand, feeling deeply uncomfortable with it. And, but then like the last like almost decade as a woman, and like understanding like how society treats people differently. And it was eye opening. Like before I transitioned, I'm 6'1", and, I was pretty hefty person. And, I never thought twice about walking home late at night on the subway. And then when I transitioned and I had one person follow me home and threaten me, I had another person, threaten me when I got off the subway, and just kind of these other things in a way that like I never experienced before, by virtue because of how I was perceived by other people. It really changes your perspectives on things. And, so in that sense, like, that's kind of a negative, but, it also makes you realize like how ridiculous sometimes gender norms are in the first place, like why things are the way they are. Like, I thought one of the funniest things that ever happened when I first transitioned was like women talk in the bathroom with each other like constantly, and that was really unsettling because when I first before I transitioned, like men don't talk in the bathrooms. They like consciously avoid eye contact. Right. They just like
in, out.
Out. And like, done. We were just having like full on conversations, and I was like, oh, okay. You just realize these like weird differences, in gender, and like so much of it is just like performativity. But like in that sense, like it has been interesting, and it really has informed my perspective a lot of times to have greater empathy with people because of that ability that like I've had to like experience the world in a way different way than most people have. Everyone always like walk a mile in someone else's shoes. In some ways, like more than a mile. I've been able to walk in different genders in that way. But like at the same time, like, yeah, it is incredibly difficult for trans people. In reality, like when I first started my career, I worked with trans asylum seekers from Central America. And these are people that faced almost certain death in their countries of origin, in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, just by virtue of who they are. And some of them walked like 1,000 miles through Mexico to get to the U.S. border. And then they came here, and with no certainty that they would have any sort of community or anything else. And I don't know if anything speaks to the fact that it's not a choice, or you can't like choose to, or you're not choosing to do this voluntarily in that sense. Other than that, right? Like your literal life is at risk. You are marching 1,000 miles through the desert to get to someplace just so you can feel safe and hope to put together some kind of basic life where, you're not going to be wealthy or rich, but you can at least like be able to go to sleep and walk the streets safely. And I think like a lot of the conversation ignores that, because I think there's this conception, I think broadly of the LGBTQ community. It's not unique to trans people. I think especially like the introduction of queer people into popular culture in the last 2 or 3 decades has been focused on this idea of like wealthier, predominantly white folks. So there's this idea, especially that like being queer is like something that's like you're wealthy, if you're queer. And that's like not the case at all if you look at all the statistics. And I think the lack of stories centering on trans immigrants, on trans people of color, especially, I think, have not shown the kind of light of like what the actual trans experience is. Like, this isn't something that people do because they're wanting to gain access to women's facility. Like, the whole thing is just so dehumanizing, as you mentioned, like Nancy Mace, like basically equating trans people to being fetishists or whatnot, like that somehow it's a fetish.
Or perverts. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? That there is this, in the kind of MAGA Republican rhetoric, that because we had this over trans people reading to children. Remember this period where there was the, story time, and that became like a whole thing. It was the same in the UK, I remember. And it just didn't really make any sense. And yet it was a perfect opportunity to dehumanize and to criticize. But nobody was like, but kids are being read to in a public library. Like, there's no perversion going on because everyone's there watching. It's like, this isn't like Catholic priests taking people into the confession room. It's like, it's nonsensical, it's gibberish, and yet it still makes headlines.
Yeah, and I think when you think of it from the perspective of like the attack on trans people is an attempt to maintain power for certain people, especially like white men, and you think of like how sexual abuse actually happens, it's a function of power, right? Like where the biggest scandals of sexual abuse happen? It's been the Catholic Church, it's been Boy Scouts, it's been political figures, it's been bosses and leaders in their respective fields, people like Harvey Weinstein. Like, those were the biggest monsters have been, and it's because they have power over other people. And if you want power over other people, being trans is not the route to have power over other people. In more ways, you lose a lot of power and you lose a lot of ability to navigate the world safely. And so, in that way, it's like I think that conversation about power and like how that, it's easier to look at a person in drag or a trans person and other them and then say like, they're deviant, versus like having the hard conversation of the reality that more likely than not, it's going to be a family member or a clergy member or, someone in your kids, like a teacher or something, a trusted person, but more likely not just a family member, someone that engages in abusive behavior. And so it's a misplaced effort to demonize a community that, it protects power, because these same people are running to protect Russell Brand and Andrew Tate. And I mean, Andrew Tate was literally or allegedly trafficking minors in Romania. So and he's celebrated on the right. So that's what's so frustrating about this whole conversation about how they try to label trans people as a threat.
Well, Kyle Rittenhouse was celebrated on the right as well, and he went murdering people for fun, it seems. And so it doesn't make sense. I think that's where I keep coming back to with this, is that we often try to intellectualize and analyze the indefensible or insanity, but we're going to keep doing it. We have to take another quick break, but I want to finally kind of talk about pushback and lawmakers, of course, and Sarah McBride as a perfect example. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Do you ever think about how much of your life you actually spend sleeping? It's about a third. That's a lot of time to be laying on something that could be full of toxins or worse, heating you up at night. That's why I switched to an avocado mattress. They're made with certified organic latex, wool and cotton, no chemicals, no weird off-gassing, just clean, cool, naturally breathable comfort. And honestly, it feels like luxury without the guilt. My personal favorite, the Avocado Green Mattress. It's their bestseller for a reason. Super comfy, supportive, and I wake up actually feeling rested. Plus, I know it's sustainably made, ethically sourced, and built to last. Avocado is mission-driven sustainability at its best. Better for you, better for the planet. Shop now at avocadomattress.com and save up to 20% on certified organic mattresses. Dream of better. We're back on the weekend show. I'm Anthony Davis, and we're joined by Alejandra Caraballo. I'm so pleased that you were able to kind of be so open with us on this subject, because, as we said earlier, it isn't a conversation that is had often enough. And part of the problem is because there aren't enough figures who have, public figures who have experience, either personal experience or who are able to kind of talk about this. Sarah McBride is the exception to that rule. And she went through a very kind of difficult sequence that went viral recently. She's the first openly transgender person to be elected to the United States Congress representing Delaware. And she was, I'm sure you saw the clip, but she was announced and introduced and referred to as a Mr. And this, this obviously kind of went viral because it was so inappropriate, but there's also, I felt, an element of ambulance chasing as well, that people found it titillating in some way. And that there are others, of obviously people who, not all, but some people who voted for Trump, who actually enjoy this kind of egregious behavior towards minority groups, including to immigrants who are being deported or have their faces on posters outside the White House. So let's just talk to this kind of idea that we do need to be more public and more communicative on this subject.
Yeah. I think in some ways, what drives the Republicans so crazy about Sarah McBride is that, they have just spent years demonizing this group of folks, the trans community, and now they have to look at a trans person as a colleague on equal footing with them. And I think, in particular, someone like Nancy Mace, it just drives her insane. She doesn't want to have to view a trans person as an equal. And I think a lot of her statements play in that way. And I think there's also this kind of immune response where I think they realize that if they have a trans colleague who's able to humanize the debate, and just, it's not just a debate about trans people without trans people being involved, it makes it much harder. And it's harder for their own members, especially if they get to know her, and become friends with her, to actually, engage in those same kinds of attacks. And I think they really wanted to be hostile from the get-go, to be able to push her out or to make it so impossible for her to have friends on the other side of the party. And I've been somewhat critical of McBride's approach just because I think there's value in extending grace to others, especially those who are just viciously attacking you. I think it's another thing to not let yourself become a doormat for other people. And I think that's the most difficult tightrope. And I don't envy, Sarah's position at all. But I think contrast that with someone like Zoe Zephyr, who in Montana was really, did not allow those kinds of attacks to stand, right? She didn't just meekly take it. She pushed back in a meaningful way. But then, that courage and that ability to withstand that and push back in a respectful way won her a lot of allies, even among the Republicans. She was able to kill quite a few anti-trans bills this session, because she'd become friends with a lot of the Republicans there, and they got to see her for who she was. And I think that is a much better model in terms of how to navigate this moment as an elected trans person, which is you really have to not let yourself become a doormat, but also be strategic about how you engage, push back where it's warranted. And the lack of respect is clearly visible. But at the same time, make sure that they see you as human, right? Get to know them and be that kind of a person that can put a face to the kinds of debates that they're having. And I think that that's what scares Republicans more than anything is someone like Zoe Zephyr who, is able to destroy their narratives and be able to build coalitions just through good old fashioned politicking. And so I think that that's why these kinds of attacks are always so over the top. And I think in some ways, like, it is incredibly cruel, and it sends a message to other people that this kind of cruelty is okay, that you can do this. Like, my worry in particular is what's going to happen with younger kids and younger generations. Like, I've heard from friends with kids now that, gay is making its comeback as a slur, right? Like, we've already seen the renormalization of the R slur, against people with mental disabilities. And it's particularly frustrating on that end, because kids notice these things. And when they see adults acting this way, they pick up on it and think that it's a normal thing to do. And that's what worries me, because younger kids, younger trans kids, queer kids, others, like, they aren't in the position to push back against this as much. And they're much more vulnerable. And so that's what worries me more than anything. But yeah, it's not an easy path to be in. And it's one that I think is just going to take a lot more effort and grace by a lot more folks. But I think it's a generational project. Barney Frank was the first openly gay congressman in the 90s, and it took 2 decades before marriage equality happened. So, like, this is a long generational struggle. Now that we've achieved more visibility in the public consciousness.
Anti-trans legislation is exploding across the country right now, and it's a lot of it's being led by and financed by some of the same groups that pushed for Roe versus Wade to be overturned. And a lot of them these groups are claiming to fight for parents' rights and saying, I don't want my child turned trans by the teacher and this kind of stuff. The idea that you drop your child off as a boy and pick them up as a girl. It's completely nonsensical, but it has gained traction. And as you mentioned earlier, books are being removed from library shelves, the very books that would support a young person's ability to identify how they might be feeling about themselves. So let's just talk to this for a moment, because, the Department of Education is being shut down. And a lot of it starts and ends there, as I see it. If you're leaving education to the states, then Republican states will never even go there when it comes to educating young people about gender, for fear that they might decide to be trans. Just explain the reality of that for us.
Yeah, the war on education in particular is really about their idea of indoctrinating the next generation to not tolerate LGBTQ people. That's the reality of it. Part of it is also demagoguing to gain political power. One of the co-founders of Moms for Liberty that had really been spearheading this was having threesomes with her boyfriend that they are arranging. It just, like, the hypocrisy is just so stunning. And it's really just a testament to, like, this is a political tool for them, but one that they view as, like, they think that society has gone too far in just even acknowledging that trans people exist. And so therefore, like, all mention should be eliminated. And, as I mentioned before, like, we have so many historical examples of trans people existing before there was any idea of, like, what transness was, or, like, what it meant to be trans. Like, we just existed as we were because that's the only way we knew how to be. And so if they think that somehow getting rid of books or getting rid of, like, discussion or conversation is somehow going to eliminate the existence of trans people, like, they're sorely mistaken. Like, that's not going to happen. It's not going to work. But what they are going to do is they're going to make it much more miserable and terrible for trans folks who are going, like, through that. They're basically trying to normalize the bigotry. But I think this isn't unique to the United States, right? Like the other countries that we've seen this kind of backsliding on LGBTQ rights in a particularly pernicious way, Hungary, Russia come to mind.
All of Trump's favorite leaders, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like this authoritarianism is part and parcel, this strongman authoritarianism is part and parcel with this kind of anti-LGBTQ, anti-feminist backlash, right? Like, they try to characterize it as quote unquote gender ideology, but it's a nebulous concept that they can't even really truly define. It's in some instances, it's acknowledging the existence of trans people. On other instances, acknowledging that women should be equal to men is like considered gender ideology. And so really it's trans people are the Trojan horse to instill what I call like the gender bureaucracy, which is essentially a way to police gender norms and gender expression in a way that is more rigid and doesn't allow for broader expression, right? So a lot of people are like, well, how do you actually enforce bathroom bans? Aren't, cis women who are, more masculine in appearance, especially like butch lesbians, going to be targeted? And I think that that's a feature, not a bug, of the panic against trans folks. Because more cis, just this week in Boston, there was a lesbian couple, and one of the women was confronted by a man who entered the women's bathroom to confront her and was knocking on her stall because he believed that she was a man and didn't belong in the women's bathroom. And I think a lot of people are like, well, obviously, like cis women are going to be disproportionately impacted just because there's more of them, and more of them are going to be masculine in appearance than hyper feminine trans women would be impacted by this. And again, like I said, it's a feature, not a bug. Like they want to push hyper femininity. They want women to look like Fox News.
Well, they also don't want them to work, and they don't want them to vote, and they want them just to look after their men in the home and have as many children as possible. I mean, this is the Handmaid's Tale, isn't it? As is written.
That's exactly it. And like what people don't understand, what's so insidious about the attacks on trans folks is that it gives them the language and the toolbox to push that through and get women on board with that project.
Right.
Right. Like that's the craziest thing about it. I think like one of the perfect examples of this was Trump signed the executive order banning trans people from sports in the US. And it was widely reported. It was all over the place. And then the next day, I think it was the next day, he signed another executive order that eliminated the parity requirements for payment for female athletes in the NCAA, right? So the athletes now are getting paid in the colleges. And one of the guidances that they had issued through the Department of Education previously was that if you're paying male athletes a certain amount to compete, you have to have parity with your female athletes. And they rescinded that guidance, basically saying, no, go ahead, pay your female athletes far less. And that directly impacts their ability to feed themselves, right? Like these athletes who are probably not, especially for women's sports that don't already get paid much anyways, that has a much more tangible direct impact on the participation of sports by women than the 10 trans athletes out of 500,000 in the NCAA. So again, but on the other side, the Trump administration is saying, well, we're saving women's sports. I'm like, what actually matters here? Banning 10 trans women nationwide from sports, or ensuring that ensuring that female athletes are adequately compensated and paid. Like,
well, he's bringing back Christmas as well. So, this is it, isn't it? I mean, it's almost like living in the twilight zone, and to be educated or to really be able to think critically, to engage, to be activated. None of that stuff is compatible with this current regime. They want people to comply, be silent, and, again, if we're drawing parallels from history, this is not going to end well, is it?
No. Yeah, I mean, I'm not in the short term, very optimistic about the trajectory we're on. Not just for trans people. I think like trans people in some ways and immigrants in particular, canaries in the coal mine, but this kind of authoritarian politics never ends well. And it almost always leads to disaster. And I think, I've been, I think, called an alarmist in some ways about like what is going to end up happening down the line. And I think I've been calling for trans folks in particular and LGBTQ folks broadly. Like, I think if you can get out of the United States, you should take that opportunity, because I don't see an off ramp in the short term that is going to undo the kinds of damage that is going to take, frankly, decades to undo. And in the meantime, I think the most important thing for any trans person or queer person to do in the interim is to survive. Like, they don't want us to exist. And so our survival is the most important thing that we can do. And if that means like having to leave the country, then that matters, right? Like, there's like history's littered with examples of groups who got out, and the only reason why they were able to tell the stories and it was because they left when they did. And I think that's a conversation that's very difficult, but especially in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, I have friends that were in the military and they're leaving the United States. They're trans people. And so in some ways, I think some people think that it's sad, and I think it is, but I think on the other hand, like, it's resilience and a willingness to survive above all else that matters. And I think that that's ultimately what's most important in this moment.
It's ironic that you're kind of safer in Mexico than you are in the US right now when it comes to this. If only Canada wasn't so cold. But, this is a lot of people, not just immigrants, but certainly, permanent residents, even naturalized citizens, whatever their gender, are having these same conversations right now. And to feel unsafe in supposedly the free world it is depressing. And I have also faced some pushback because, I'm not particularly optimistic, but I do think that I am realistic. And I think that's really important because, we can polish this turd as much as we like, right? But it's, ultimately, I don't see Republicans giving way anytime soon. They're not going to be convinced, and they're certainly not going to leave office without a fight.
Yeah. I mean, I get so much pushback for saying this, but I think in terms of a realistic perspective, even if tomorrow, by some miracle, a Democrat came into office, the amount of damage that has been done in the first 100 days is already going to take years to undo. The number of federal employees that have been left, the offices that have been gutted, the systems that have been just completely dismantled across the federal government. I mean, it's already going to take years to undo that damage. And we're only in the first 100 days. We have, over 3.5 years left of this. And so by time, even if a Democrat gets elected in 2028, they would have to spend more than 2 terms just rebuilding what has already been destroyed. And I think, what does that mean in practice? And I think the realistic conversation to have with people right now is that we are going to experience a complete collapse in not only living standards, but life expectancy. We are going to be sicker, poorer, and less educated as a country and as a whole. And we're going to see diseases that we once thought eradicated, such as measles and whooping cough and others, polio, make a very unsettling comeback. Foodborne illnesses becoming widespread again. And we're just going to see a collapse in living standards that I think has been seen since the collapse of the USSR. And I think that is the equivalent. I think telling people that regardless of what we do in this moment, I don't think there's anything that we can really do in this moment to stop that trajectory. And a lot of people are like, well, that's doomer, that's fatalistic. And I'm like, it's not. That's a realistic appraisal of where we're at. Now, we also have to make plans on how we fix it, but obviously we have to understand that fixing that's going to take decades.
Well, the only way to fix it is to win elections. There doesn't seem to be another way, because the Department of Justice is in the tank for Trump, which means that there's no kind of legal protections anymore. The separation of powers is done. Separation of church and state is over. They have a clean sweep, including the High Court. So, it's a pretty frightening landscape, but that doesn't mean that. I suppose there's more of us than there are of them is probably the saving grace, because if we add the number of people who either didn't vote or didn't have their votes counted in the last election to the number of Democrats that did vote, then you really are looking at a supermajority for anti-Trump and pro-democracy voters.
Yeah, I'm optimistic in the long term in this, like generationally, in the sense that these kinds of moments allow things to possibilities that weren't possible before, right? Like obviously that means it can also work in horrifying ways, like towards fascism. But, ultimately we could also rethink, like, maybe our Constitution needs to be rewritten. Maybe we need a new Constitution. Maybe we need a new electoral system that moves away from this idea of an electoral college or this viscerally anti-democratic Senate structure. I mean, we move towards a modern parliamentary democracy, or these kinds of broader ideas where we have human rights in our charter from the get-go, right? Like right to health, right to life, like all of these various things, right to privacy are just enshrined directly in a constitution. And I think from that perspective, like those are the kinds of goals that we need to think of, because if we just think that we're just going to win another election, we're going to end right back up here, because that's what happened with Biden in 2020. We won the election. The protesters went home. We decided, we can just ignore politics again. Yeah. And we ended up with Trump again. And if we don't fundamentally rework our system in a revolutionary way, we're just going to end up back here again. And so I think like this is also an opportunity to think bigger than the politics that got us here.
I think that's very sage advice. We also should probably look to Russia and look to Hungary and to see the types of societies that Trump is building and that his enablers are building, because they see those autocracies as success stories, and being trans in Russia is against the law. Yeah. And at the same time, like the other country is Hungary, where they just recently passed a constitutional ban on having LGBTQ events in public, and banning recognition of trans people in the constitution. And Hungary is now it went from one of the premier countries, like the kind of shining success stories of like the post-Soviet Eastern republics, and it is now the poorest country in the EU. They've suffered a massive brain drain, and on all metrics, their life expectancy is declining. Like all of the measures that we look to of a healthy society are on the decline. And so it may work for the people at the top. It may work for Orban. It may work for Putin. It may work for the oligarchs in those respective countries, but it doesn't work for the vast majority of people. And so sure, they might have been able to ban trans people in those countries, but it's not like they even got better societies out of it. They got sicker, poorer societies at the same time. And so I think fundamentally you have to realize that a tolerant, pluralistic social democracy is you need that for human thriving and to have a healthy society. And I think that's the fundamental miscalculation of the authoritarians, is that they think it works for them and the people in power, but it doesn't work for the rest of society. Alejandra Caraballo, thank you for joining The Weekend Show.
Of course.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News, or by joining the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. I'll come back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.